It's good to get back into the book of Matthew. We're going to be covering chapter 5, verses 27 through 37 this morning. The title of the sermon is Tax Code Christianity, but it's not a sermon about taxes. We'll save that one for April. I think most of us are glad that we have laws. I'm not so sure how we feel about tax laws, though. We might not be as excited about those. One thing is for sure, the tax code in our country has grown exponentially. The statutes that Congress has passed is 2,652 pages. But if you truly want to follow the tax code, you're going to need more than that. You need the IRS regulations. And so when you put the regulations with the statutes together, you get around 9,000 pages. And if you really want to follow the tax code, you're going to need more than that. Because if you're like a tax lawyer and things like that, you need to know case law, because most court cases are going to be solved with preceding court case and how that works. So the standard federal tax reporter puts out, the Commerce Clearinghouse puts out the standard federal tax reporter that includes the statutes, regulations, and case law, and that is about 70,000 pages long. And that's what they have to study to follow the tax code. Tax Foundation charted tax complexity over time. You see, in 1913, the federal income tax started as 4 pages of forms and instructions. That was it, 4 pages. And it stayed pretty simple for a while until the 1940s. And by 1955, the tax code and regulations were up to 1.4 million words. And since then, they've been growing at a pace of about 144,500 words per year. And by 2015, they were over 10 million words. The tax code has gotten complicated, and with that extra complication has come more confusion about it, more effort to skirt around it, and more hatred toward it. And this is not dissimilar to what the scribes and Pharisees had done with the laws of God. They had made it more and more complicated, complex, burdensome, unnecessarily, and what that did is they got away from the heart of it, from God's intent for His law, and in doing so, they took people's hearts away from God until people were following God kind of like Americans follow the tax code. And that's a problem. Well, how would you like it if we just did away with this complex tax code? We made things simple. Let's simplify everything. Let's institute a flat tax, 75% of your income, no more taxes, that's it. We'll make it simple. Well, you see, Jesus came and He made things a lot simpler. But don't confuse simple with easy. You see, following Jesus is simpler than following the religious system of the scribes and the Pharisees, but it requires even more. And that's not a bad thing, and I'll come back to that at the end. But before we jump into this passage, let's pray. God, we ask that You would speak to us this morning, Lord. It's not about me speaking. It's about You. It's about Your word. It's about whatever You may have given me that is needed. Help us to listen. Lord, help us to avoid a tax code Christianity, but instead to love You. And throughout this sermon, I hope that we'll learn what that really looks like and what it doesn't. And I pray this in Christ's name. Amen. So we're going to start with just verse 27, where Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, 'Do not commit adultery.'" All right, now it was a given in Jesus' audience that adultery was wrong. He was speaking to people who would have agreed with Him on this issue. Now He's about to rattle their cages and He's going to take things to another level, but at least they had that going for them. But when I was studying this, I realized, wait a second, this audience and the audience who may be watching this, whenever, wherever, we can't take that for granted, right? That is not a given in our society, that people agree even on this. Certainly most people still consider adultery to be morally wrong. In fact, A Gallup poll found that only 9% of Americans consider adultery to be morally acceptable. But I think there's another poll that will actually give us a little more insight into what Americans really think. You see that a survey from the Survey Center on American Life found some different numbers, and I think it's because they used the word always. All right, so when they were asking, they asked whether people felt that adultery was always wrong. And they asked different questions. They asked about men committing adultery and women committing adultery, and they asked different demographics. So their survey has all the stats broken down into whether you're asking men or women, what age they are, what race they are, what their level of education is, and things like that. But of all the demographics, if you look at every different demographic, the highest one that said it was always wrong was 75%. And there was one demographic where only 45% of that demographic said that it was always wrong. And it varied as well whether you were asking about, not asking, but asking about men or women. That's interesting. See, amongst all men, 61% said it was always wrong for a man to have an affair. And 53% said it was always wrong for a woman to have an affair. Right? It's weird. But listen to this. Amongst all women, 70% said it's always wrong for a man to commit adultery, and 56% said it was always wrong for a woman. Even bigger gap there. You see, in every demographic, the number was always higher when asking about men and lower for women. And it varied depending on who you were asking and all the different demographics, but that was always true. Like the gap was different, the amount was different, but that was always true. So for some reason, Americans think that it's more morally acceptable for women to commit adultery than for men. Well, the picture that I really get from these two different polls is that Americans believe that adultery is generally wrong, for the most part. But it gets a lot foggier when you use that word always. Furthermore, the world doesn't all think the same way that we do on this issue. 40% of the French think that adultery is not a moral issue. 27% of Spain, 26% of Germany, 24% of Senegal, 17% of Canada, and so on. Noel, I don't know how you pronounce his name, but Noel Biderman founded the website Ashley Madison, which is a website that was designed to help married men and women have affairs. And he said, having an affair can save a marriage. None of us anywhere are engineered for monogamy. People don't want to get divorced. They just want to have their cake and eat it too. Well, I want to tell you something this morning because I don't want there to be any confusion on this subject. I want to make sure we're clear that we're straight. Adultery is always wrong, all right? God created humans for monogamy. He couldn't have made it any clearer in Exodus 20:14. You shall not commit adultery. There's no ifs, ands, or buts. No exception clause to that. And that's not all. Even though 76% of Americans don't believe this, sex outside of marriage between one man and one woman is always wrong. Genesis 2:24, that's why a man leaves his wife, his father and mother, and is united to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. That's the beginning of that teaching. And what does that be united to his wife, becoming one flesh? That is signified by the sexual relationship. And we see further in 1 Corinthians 7:1-3, now for the matters you wrote about, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. So what Paul's beginning with there is like, hey, being single is okay. And he says it's okay to be single, to not have sex. But, verse 2, since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. The husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. So what is that sexual immorality that's happening? Well, it's many things, but one of them is they're having sex and they're not married. And Paul's like, it's fine to be single, to not have sex, but if you're going to do it, you need to be married. A man to a woman, one man, one woman. Furthermore, Hebrews 13:4, marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. See, there's more to sexual immorality than just adultery. And that's not all. I don't have a statistic about what Americans think about lust. And why do I not have that statistic? Because no surveyors ever bothered to ask that question. Probably because they assume that nobody cares. Which might be a safe assumption because 41% of our country thinks that pornography is morally acceptable. So I can't imagine when we're talking about just run-of-the-mill lust. But Jesus cares. And what he said in verse 28, I tell you, everyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Maybe this is why people believe it's more acceptable for women to cheat than men. Jesus says everyone who looks at a woman lustfully. So if you look at men lustfully, you're off the hook. Not. That's wrong. Let's get this abundantly clear. Like I already said, adultery, sex outside of marriage between one man and one woman, and lust of anyone other than your spouse is always wrong. You might not want to hear that. We might want to come up with some kind of excuse, some kind of a way out of this truth, but it's not there. We have to acknowledge it. We have to accept it. We have to take it seriously. And in order to understand this appropriately, we also need to clearly define lust. See, thinking that someone of the opposite gender is attractive, that's not lust. Thinking that someone is attractive or being attracted to someone of the opposite gender does not constitute lust itself. There's no problem with that. That's actually part of God's design for us. There's a lot of things within God's design for us that have been corrupted, that have been messed up over human history. And certainly our attractions have been messed up, and we're going to talk about that. But attraction itself to someone of the opposite gender is not the same as lust. That is part of God's design. It is something that we feel for our spouses before we get married and while we are married. This does not mean, though, that all attraction is okay. Don't misunderstand that. I'm not going to go into a full teaching on that. We've done sermons on those subjects before, and this text is not specifically about that. But I need to point out that sin does not only come into play when we're talking about lust. Lust may always be wrong, but attraction is not always right either. Sometimes attractions themselves have been marred, corrupted by sin. Attraction to someone of the same gender is not part of God's design for us. But we also don't need to act like that's the only attraction that's not part of God's design for us. And our society struggles with this because they can't figure out what to do with attractions, because the thinking is, well, how can something that's natural be wrong? And that's the argument. But then that argument runs into so many problems in our society when people start realizing, wait a second, there are some people who are attracted to their brother or sister, or their mom or dad, or vice versa. And even our society is like, oh, we're not ready for that one yet. Give us a little more time. And some people, they're realizing like, oh, there's these people that are attracted to children. And so the thought is like, well, what do we do? We can't say that the attraction is wrong, because then what does that do to our entire system, our entire framework? We can't use that same logic, but most people don't want pedophilia. So what does our society do? It's like what we do with anger. We have anger, and let's make a rage room where people can just go crazy. Well, vent it out. Do it here. It's okay here. Instead of being like, no, actually, the anger is the problem. Well, with this kind of stuff, what do? We make sex robots and AI porn, so that people with these attractions that we're like, well, we can't say their attraction's wrong. Let's just give them an avenue to fulfill their desires safely. Because if we said that the desire itself was wrong, then what does that do to our entire framework? Everything comes crumbling down. All the arguments that we've been making to accept all of the things that we want to be legal, it's just gone. It's all contradictions and destruction when we move away from God's design. And Jesus clarifies, it's not just about what or who we're touching. It's about what we're thinking, what we're feeling. And we move from attraction into lust, when our thoughts move from, that person has a nice face or a nice figure, to, I want to be with that face or that figure. There's a difference between seeing someone and gazing at someone. There's a difference between noticing someone and fantasizing about someone, and it's really easy to cross that line, and it happens fast. Glances turn into stares, turn into thoughts, and that can all happen within milliseconds. You notice someone with a quick glance, you look away, and then the fight begins. It's like the bell rings, and you find yourself in the ring, and you're like, well, what am I going to do now? I noticed someone attractive. Well, I don't know. Maybe I didn't get a very good look. Maybe they're not attractive. I need to get a better look and figure out. And then you're going through this fight in your head, and what do people do that don't care? Well, we know what they do. They don't care, so they look, they stare, they imagine, and they're like, there's nothing wrong with that. But those of us who do care, we're at least wise enough to put up a fight, and what does that fight look like? We're like, well, I'm just going to take another quick glance, no, don't do that, no. You sit there and you're, just a quick one, don't. Stop it. Think about football. Oregon won. The Beavers lost. And we have to remember how prone we are to make up any kind of excuse we can think of to give into our lusts. We're like, well, I'm just looking. Ain't nothing wrong with looking. Well, there's nothing inherently wrong with looking at a person, but we have to ask two questions. Why are we looking, and where are we looking? Right? Where are your eyes focused? And why are they focused on that particular spot? Where is your mind going? Where is all of this leading? It's one thing if I'm looking at their hair because I'm like interested in their hairstyle. I'm like, oh, that's kind of cool. I wonder how they did that. Or I'm looking at their tattoos on their arm. I'm like, I wonder what those mean. It's different if I'm looking at something else and curious about something else. And what should we do? Jesus makes it abundantly clear how serious this is. And what should we do when we truly come to the realization that lust is a serious issue that we cannot just accept, that we must fight? Well, we need to do whatever it takes. That's what Jesus said. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. For it's better that you lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it's better that you lose one of the parts of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. First, let's make sure that we understand this appropriately. Jesus is not literally telling his followers to gouge out their eyes and cut off their hands. All right, in church history, there was a guy named Origen who castrated himself because of this passage. He didn't interpret it well. All right? We have no examples, anything like that in the New Testament of Jesus' followers doing that kind of a thing. And it wouldn't work, okay? That's the real crux of the issue. He's using hyperbole. It wouldn't work. You could gouge out you can still lust without your eyes, without your hands, without your genitalia. You do that right here in your mind. So you'd have to cut your brain out, which is called suicide. And we know that that's not okay. But Jesus is making the point that we should be willing to do whatever it takes to pursue purity. Furthermore, is Jesus saying in this passage that if we lust again that we're going to hell? No, he's not saying that. But I believe he is alluding to the reality that those who do not fight sin, that's where they're going to end up. See, Christians still sin. We know that. But Christians don't just accept sin and ignore sin. When it's brought to their attention, they go to war against it. And that's what Jesus tells us to do. If that show causes you to sin, it's time to change the channel. If that billboard causes you to sin, it's time to find a different route to drive. If that website causes you to sin, it's time to stop going to it. And if you aren't strong enough to do that yet, then get some kind of software that will block it for you. And then you will grow. If that coworker causes you to sin, you're tempted by them constantly, avoid them. And if you can't figure out how to do that, if that won't work, then you got to figure out what will work. You might have to go to more extremes. You might have to ask for a different position, to be relocated, or to get a different job. Are we willing to do whatever it takes as opposed to compromising and falling into sin? And I don't want to go into too much detail on all of this today because I preached a sermon just a couple months ago on temptation, and we dealt with a lot of that. But the idea is that we should be willing to do whatever it takes to pursue purity in our lives, and whatever it takes might hurt. And Jesus wasn't telling us to literally gouge out our eyes, but he is saying like, hey, do things that hurt, right? That would be a painful thing to do. Jesus isn't saying just do what's comfortable, what's convenient, what the society would be considered reasonable for a regular person. No, he's saying you need to be extreme about this. The kind of behavior that he's calling us to is the kind that the world would look at us and say, you're weird. This is unreasonable. Why would anyone do this? And this is not only true of how we fight our own temptation, but how we prevent tempting others. Romans 14:13 says, therefore let us not pass judgment on one another any longer, but rather decide never to put a stumbling block or hindrance in the way of a brother. Now the context of this passage is food. And Paul is making the case that all food is clean, but we should be willing to forego eating certain things in the interest of others. But then he goes on to say in verse 20 and 21, do not for the sake of food destroy the work of God. Everything is indeed clean, but it is wrong for anyone to make another stumble by what he eats. It is good not to eat meat or drink wine or do anything that causes your brother to stumble. Anything is important there. The principle applies to all facets of life. We should not cause others to stumble, which means that we also have a duty, a responsibility to protect others. Right? And that looks all kinds of things that we can do. We have a duty to dress modestly. This goes for men and women and men, like this, the guys too, right? Some guys out there, they want to take their shirts off all the time. And I don't know why. It's just they hate shirts, and they always want to take their shirts off. And some of you guys are like, well, it doesn't matter for me. If I'm causing anyone to stumble, it's because they're tripping over my gut. But I get that. But like this is for all of us. We've got to protect other people. We have a responsibility to dress modestly, to not put others in compromising positions. That's why I've talked before about how important it is to make sure that our relationships with people of the opposite gender are safe. Even when there's no ill intentions, even when there's not, improper motives, we still have to protect one another. To not flirt with someone if you or they are married. It's not just about protecting my eyes and my heart and my mind. We need to protect one another from lust. And as we walk through life and we try to figure out how this looks, the best ways to do that, we also need to make every effort to make sure that our perspective is God's perspective, right? Because if we define modest according to the way America defines modest, we're going to have a problem. That's not going to take us where we want to go. All right? We tend to just ask the wrong questions in life. We ask questions like, how far is too far? That's what we're interested in. How far is too far when we're dating? Well, how far can we go without it actually being sex? When we're married, well, how much time can I spend with this other person of the opposite gender who's not my spouse without it looking suspicious or without it, crossing a line? Well, how much skin can I show without it being too much? See, we're interested in knowing where these lines are because we want to get as close to the line as possible, and we want to define the line as far as we can and then get as close to it as possible when we should be asking, wait a second, where is the line truly, and what's a good safe distance to be away from it? That's what we should be asking. And not to the point that we're just going to shut ourselves off from society. Like, we don't have to be monks. We don't have to walk around in burlap sacks everywhere. But we need to stay a safe distance away from the edge, just like we would stay a safe distance away from the edge of a cliff. Foolish people stand on the edges of cliffs. And the reality is, you might be safe standing on the edge of a cliff, but everyone I know of who has ever fallen off a cliff stood on the edge. Wise people kept their distance. And that's what we should do. Jesus goes on to say, it was also said, whoever divorces his wife must give her a written notice of divorce. But I tell you, everyone who divorces his wife, except in the case of sexual immorality, causes her to commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, I'm not going to go into a full theology of divorce and remarriage this morning, not because I'm not interested in doing that, but because Jesus goes into more detail about this subject in Matthew 19. So we're going to deal with it when we get to Matthew 19, which will also include looking back at this passage. But I do want to deal with this in its immediate context. You see, Jesus alludes to Deuteronomy 24:1 here, which says, if a man marries a woman, but she becomes displeasing to him because he finds something improper about her, he may write her a divorce certificate, hand it to her, and send her away from his house. So later in Matthew 19, when we study that, we'll see that the Old Testament and the Jewish traditional teaching about divorce misunderstood God's design and desire. Right? Divorce was legislated because of people's hard hearts. Divorce was never a part of God's design or his desire. But what had happened within Judaism is that two camps arose about divorce. And they severed ways based on their interpretation of something improper, is what this translation says. Others say something indecent, about finding something indecent in her. And so one camp, the less popular camp as you would expect, said, well, you can only divorce your wife if she's committed adultery. And in the historical context, you also need to understand is that only men could initiate the divorce, right? And there wasn't like a legal hearing. It was his prerogative. It was his decision. If he decided he wanted a divorce, then he could write a certificate, and that would be that. Super easy. Divorce was easier and more prevalent back then than it is now. Way more, if we can believe that. But even within Judaism, I mean, it was bad in the pagan culture, but even within Judaism it was rampant because the other camp, the more popular one, as you would expect, interpreted this very liberally. And so they would say, well, you can divorce your wife if she burns your food too much. And so it was just this easy way out of like, you found something displeasing. You found something improper about her. So write a certificate. Thus, we have this problem again, like with anger and lust, where the scribes and Pharisees abused God's law so that they could sin, so that they could live in sin. We don't murder, but we hate and insult and belittle and hold grudges and withhold forgiveness. We don't commit adultery, but we lust. Sure, yeah, that's fine. And with divorce, we don't commit adultery, but we divorce our wives so that we can have a different sexual partner. And Jesus comes along and says, you don't understand. Like, you're living in sin. You're living in sexual immorality, and you actually are committing adultery. And they use the same pattern of argument with all of those issues also to be like, hey, we can be dishonest people. As we see in the last part of this section today. Again, you have heard that it was said to our ancestors, you must not break your oath, but you must keep your oath to the Lord. But I tell you, don't take an oath at all, either by heaven because it is God's throne, or by the earth because it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem because it is the city of the great king. Do not swear by your head, because you cannot make a single hair black or white. But let your yes mean yes, and your no mean no. Anything more than this is from the evil one. So again, they were working these sneaky angles so that they could avoid being honest people, so that they could make oaths and then back out of them. Michael Green pointed out the scribes devised a variety of escape clauses from binding oaths. Any oath which succeeded in avoiding the name of God was not absolutely binding. One could swear by one's head, by Jerusalem, by heaven, by earth, and so on. God was not thought of as a partner in such a transaction, so to break faith was not serious. Despite the whole thou shalt not lie thing. Therefore, you would get these situations where people would make a commitment and then back out of them because, oh, I didn't cross my heart. Pinky promises don't count. And Jesus comes along and says, guys, it doesn't matter how you swear or what you swear by, it's all God's. He's involved in every single one of them. The world is His. Heaven, earth, Jerusalem, your head, it's His. You don't avoid this with your sneaky use of words. And so Jesus argues, it's just don't take oaths at all. That's better. Just be people of your word. D.A. Carson said, if one does not swear at all, one does not swear falsely. Not dissimilar reasoning was found among the Essenes, who avoided taking oaths, regarding it as worse than perjury, for they say that one who is not believed without an appeal to God stands condemned already. Now, the Essenes make a point, but some people have taken this too literally and kind of get around the point that Jesus is really making. For instance, Anabaptists and Jehovah's Witnesses will not make oaths in court. But you might remember a couple weeks ago where we were talking about anger and how, it says, do not say fool. And then we looked at, okay, this doesn't mean that using the word fool is actually literally always inherently wrong. We see with Jesus, He's using hyperbole. We're not literally supposed to cut our eyes out. And here, this does not mean that literally making a promise is always inherently absolutely wrong. Hebrews 6:13 through 17, for when God made a promise to Abraham, because He could swear by no one greater, He swore by Himself, saying, surely blessing I will bless you, and multiplying I will multiply you. And so after He had patiently endured, He obtained the promise. For men indeed swear by the greater, and an oath for confirmation is for them an end of all dispute. Thus God, determining to show more abundantly to the heirs of promise the immutability of His counsel, confirmed it by an oath. God makes oaths. It's not a sin for Him to do that. We also see Christians testifying under oath in the New Testament. See, it's not inherently sinful to make a promise, but the point is that we shouldn't need to. That's the kind of people that we should be. We shouldn't need to do those things. God shouldn't need to have done that, but He did it for our benefit because people are faithless. And we shouldn't need to make oaths. That's why Deuteronomy 23, 21, and 22 says, when you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it, for the Lord your God will certainly require it of you, and it will be a sin for you. However, if you refrain from making vows, it will not be a sin for you. It's like, just don't do it. That's better than doing it and then backing out, right? It's like with Ananias and Sapphira. You remember their story? They came in, married couple, and said, "Oh yeah, we sold this and we're giving everything to the church," and they were lying. And God struck them down, struck them dead for their lies. And I think it was Peter. I don't remember exactly, but he was like, "You didn't have to do this. Like no one was making you give everything, but you say you are, and you're lying." If they had just been honest and be like, hey, we're just going to give this much, it would not have been a sin. We're supposed to be honest people. We don't get to blame the other person because they didn't know that pinky promises didn't count, or, but swearing on your mother's grave, that counts. And just like we don't get to blame car manufacturers for people breaking into cars, like the mayor of Chicago wants to do. The reality is we should be able to just leave our cars unlocked all the time. Like the one to blame for stealing is the one who steals. The one to blame for being dishonest is the one who is dishonest. The fact that we see it necessary to swear to God or place our hands on a Bible or cross our hearts and hope to die, all of that comes from sin. It comes from the prevalence of dishonesty in our world. But we should be the kind of people who don't need to make an oath, don't need to promise, don't need to cross our hearts, don't need to put our hands on a Bible, don't need to get it in writing. Now, I get we need that stuff for our legal system, for our courts. We live in a secular world. You can't just take everybody at their word. If you go to court, you better have stuff in writing. But God says, you, followers of Christ, need to be different. For one, you need to be the kind of people who don't even go to court with one another. And for another, you need to be people who can be taken at your word. Your yes should be yes. Your no should be no. But lying is a cancer in our culture. According to a study by the University of Massachusetts, 60% of people can't go 10 minutes without lying. It's bad. People lie to doctors, employers, coworkers, spouses, children, pastors, to avoid being around people, to protect someone's feelings, to make a good impression on others, to get out of a speeding ticket. We lie about our achievements, our own feelings, what we spend on things, whether we liked a meal. We say things like, I'm fine. We're not fine. We say things like, it tastes great. And it don't taste good. I'm busy. When we're not busy. I'll do it tomorrow. I don't have any money. I don't know what happened. How did that get broken? Oh, I got stuck in traffic. It wasn't that expensive. Don't worry. Oh, I forgot. I'm listening. That makes sense. Nice to see you. Oh, I never saw that email. Must have gone to my spam. I'm almost there. I couldn't get a phone signal. This gift is from Santa. Lying is like America's favorite pastime. I mean, we almost force people to do it nowadays. I would like a box to click that says, I have not read but agree to these terms and conditions. But how can we make our yes be yes and our no be no? Well, I've got 3 things to help us there. First of all, we need to take lying seriously. There's no such thing as a faithful fabrication or divine deception. We need to realize that. We should not be okay with these acceptable practices of our world. If you're not fine, don't say that you're fine. If you're not busy, don't say that you're busy. If you got up late, don't make up a story that you got stuck in traffic or you had a flat tire or whatever it is. Like, just be honest and accept the consequences. A lot of our lying has to do with our lack of faith, because we convince ourselves, we believe that lying is better for us than telling the truth sometimes, and it's not. We need to trust God that we can tell the truth and we'll accept the consequences. And sometimes telling the truth is going to bring consequences. But we need to accept the fact that it's okay. And they're going to be good for us. They're going to be necessary. And God will use them for our good. Taking lying seriously includes lying by omission as well. And I've preached on that before. You know, sometimes we lie to people by saying things that aren't true. And sometimes we don't say things that are true and that we need to say, that they need to know. Second, you should be careful with your words. I don't mean be sneaky with your words, like you're trying to deceive people without actually lying. You know, I preached on that before too, right? The foundational issue here is deception. We need to not be people of deception. But I'm talking about how often we say things that we hope to be true, we wish will be true, we want to be true, but we just don't know. And a lot of times this happens when we're trying to comfort other people. We say things like, you'll be fine. It's all going to be okay. You're not going to die. I'll always be here. They're in heaven now. And we say things, well-intentioned things. Sometimes when we're not careful, we try to comfort others, but we got to realize that lies cannot bring godly comfort. Only truth can do that. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to go around being discomforting to people, but we need to be careful with our words because lies are sinful and they don't help. And they will come back to bite us. You know, even when we're well-intentioned, when we're telling people these things, when they don't turn out to be true, they're going to remember that. And then the next time we need to comfort them, they're not going to know, are you really being honest with me, or are you just telling me what I want to hear? And third, we need to be careful with our commitments. We live in a society where it is very common to promise way too much. We overpromise and underdeliver. That is our culture. It happens with work, children, friends, church, politics, the list goes on. Christians need to buck that trend. Don't make a commitment to your kids, to your spouse, to anyone else that you might not follow through with, that you might not be able to follow through with. So I recommend, instead of saying things like, I will, say things like, I will try. I want to be there. I will do my best, but I can't make any promises. I'm planning to be there. I'm planning to do this, Lord willing. We're careful with those words. We're careful with those commitments. So then we don't put ourselves in that position. Like Jesus says, just don't make oaths. It's better not to make the commitment than to make commitments that you're going to break. And this is another reason why I think people need to be more careful with their wedding vows. Again, we're not getting into a full teaching on divorce and remarriage, but when we do, we will look into more deeply, is there actually a biblical exception for divorce? But think about it this way. Even if you believe that divorce is biblically permissible for adultery, how many people put that in their wedding vows? I've never heard exception clauses in people's wedding vows. What I hear is, till death do us part. And so and here's the thing, even if you get divorced for what you might consider to be biblically permissible divorce, you've broken your vow because you weren't careful with your words. You weren't careful with your commitments. And so then you've made that divorce a sin. Can we see how important it is to take lying seriously? We have to ask ourselves, would God do this? Would God deceive in the way that I'm deceiving someone? Would God say the words that I'm saying? Is he okay with this? Now, I know it seems like we hit these different subjects today. It's like, oh, it's lust, and oh, it's divorce, and oh, it's honesty. It might feel disconnected, but it is all connected, and it connects the way that I said at the beginning. It's all about how we try to follow God like we try to follow the tax code. We're always looking for some way to skirt the rules. When we read it, we'll interpret some things really strictly and then other things really liberally, depending on what we want to get out of it. And really, we would prefer not to read it at all, because then we won't know if our thinking about it is wrong. We'd rather just go with what we've heard or what we think it should be. And we're okay with drawing lines, but let's just try to make the lines as far as we can, and then we want to walk right on them. But that kind of self-professed Christianity is a dangerous trap, because if that's the way that you're following God, you're not actually following God. That's the problem. That's the heart of the issue. We will end up in hell if that's us, because our hearts are far from Him. And we can continue down that path, or we can say, you know what, Jesus, you're right. I haven't been taking you seriously. I haven't been taking you seriously because I haven't actually loved you. I didn't really want to follow you. I wanted to go to heaven, but I wanted to somehow follow myself into heaven, and I realize now that that's not possible. And I'm ready to end this nonsense and take you seriously. See, following Jesus is simple, but it's hard. He came in. He simplified the tax code. He came in and he said, enough with all this nonsense. You guys have made it way too complex, way too complicated, way too burdensome. I'm going to simplify it. I'm going to institute a flat tax 100%. I want all of you. And we hear that and we think, well, that's even worse. Like, we're worse off than we were before. Just like when Jesus taught about divorce in Matthew 19, and he's telling them, like, here's the reality. And they're like, well, it's better just to not be married. And we hear these things and we're like, this is worse than the scribes and the Pharisees. But that's not true. Jesus said, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Even though he requires so much more, his yoke is easy and his burden is light. And that can only be true if you truly love him, because the yoke is only easy and the burden is only light when you're giving everything, that 100% tax, out of love for the one who gave everything on the cross for you.